The alley was a world of shadows, a forgotten pocket of the city that most people hurried past without a second glance. The dim light from the street lamps outside barely made it through the narrow gap between two tall, crumbling buildings. The walls were stained with years of grime, their surfaces cracked and scarred by time and neglect. A rusted fire escape ran up one side of the building, the iron steps barely hanging on, as though even the city itself had long since given up on this place. Alex sat on the cold concrete ground, his small frame tucked into a corner of the alley, away from the occasional footstep that passed by too close. His legs were drawn up to his chest, his knees pressed against his thin, worn t-shirt. His clothes were ragged, once a soft blue, now faded and torn, barely providing any warmth against the cool night air. The remnants of a broken sweater hung loosely around his shoulders, its fabric frayed at the edges, unraveling with each passing day. His bare feet, caked with dirt, were planted firmly on the cracked pavement. The soles of his feet were tough, hardened from running through the streets, the kind of toughness that only hardship could give a child. He stared out into the abyss, the world around him muffled by his own isolation. The distant hum of the city echoed in his ears, the steady buzz of cars, the clinking of metal from a distant factory, the voices of people too busy with their own lives to notice the boy sitting in the corner of the world. Alex was invisible to them. No one cared. No one had cared for as long as he could remember. Behind him, a large garbage can was half filled with the remnants of yesterday's meals, scraps of food, wrappers, and a half-empty bottle of something that looked far too old to drink. Alex's stomach growled faintly, the ache a reminder that hunger was an ever-present companion. He shifted his gaze toward the trash can, but he didn't reach for it just yet. He wasn't in a hurry. There would be time for that later. For now, he just sat, the weight of loneliness heavy in his chest. But there was a sound. A quiet shuffle of footsteps on the broken pavement behind him. Alex didn't flinch. He didn't need to look over his shoulder to know what it was. It was Max. Max had been his constant companion for as long as Alex could remember. A large, black dog with a coat that blended into the shadows. Max was more than just a stray, he was Alex's protector. The dog had no home, no family, nothing but the street. But for whatever reason, when Max found Alex, their bond was instant. They were two lost souls, finding comfort in each other's company in a world that had forgotten them both. Max padded over to Alex, his paws soft against the rough pavement. The dog lowered his head to Alex's lap, his eyes watching the boy with quiet intensity. Max's amber eyes gleamed in the dim light, filled with an understanding that Alex couldn't put into words. The dog didn't need to bark or wag his tail. His presence alone was enough to comfort Alex, to make him feel like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as the world made him feel. Alex leaned down, his hand instinctively reaching out to scratch behind Max's ears. The dog responded with a low, satisfied hum, his eyes closing slightly in contentment. It was a small gesture, but to Alex, it meant everything. Max had been there through it all. When Alex's mother had died, when his father had walked out, when the world had seemed too large and too cruel. Max had never abandoned him. Max was his family. For a brief moment, Alex allowed himself to close his eyes, to let the warmth of the dog's presence settle over him like a blanket. It didn't matter that the night air was cold or that the alley was far from safe. As long as Max was with him, Alex felt a small sense of peace. A quiet sort of safety that no one else had ever given him. The sounds of the city faded into the background, replaced by the steady, rhythmic sound of Max's breathing. The dog's body was warm against his legs, and for a while, that warmth was all Alex needed. He didn't think about the hunger in his stomach, the ache in his limbs, or the pain of the past. He didn't think about how they had no future, no real home. In that moment, it was just him and Max, two beings lost in a world that didn't care, finding solace in each other's company. But even in the silence, there was an unease, a lingering feeling that this life was not meant to be their only reality. Something in Alex's heart told him that there was more out there, more than just surviving. He didn't know what that more was, but he felt it deep within himself, like a small flicker of hope, buried under layers of pain and uncertainty. Max shifted in his lap, his large head resting against Alex's thigh, as though sensing the boy's thoughts. The dog's warm eyes looked up at him, and Alex's heart swelled with emotion. No matter what came next, he knew he wouldn't face it alone. As long as Max was with him, they would survive. The alley may have been their home for now, but Alex was beginning to believe that there could be something more. Something better. The first faint rays of hope were starting to break through the thick clouds of despair, and for the first time in a long time, Alex felt the smallest stirrings of something he hadn't felt in years. Possibility. The sound of his mother's voice echoed in Alex's mind, clear and soft, as if she were still there beside him. "Sweetheart, close your eyes. Let's go on an adventure." Alex could still feel the warmth of her arms around him as she tucked him into bed, the smell of lavender and honey lingering in the air. It was a time when the world had seemed full of wonder and possibility. His mother's soft, melodic voice would fill the room as she read stories to him before he drifted off to sleep. They were never ordinary stories, stories of knights battling dragons, of magical lands hidden deep in the forest, of families who loved each other no matter what. In those moments, Alex believed in the magic. He believed that things could be better, that the world outside their tiny apartment could be as warm and comforting as the love he felt in his mother's embrace. Those memories, though distant, remained etched in Alex's heart. He could still recall the way his mother smiled at him, her eyes bright with affection and hope. She was the light of his life, the person who made him feel like he mattered in a world that often didn't. But those moments didn't last forever. Alex's mother had always worked long hours, sometimes late into the night, just to keep the small apartment they shared. She worked as a waitress at a local diner, earning just enough to keep them afloat. But no matter how tired she was, she would always come home with a smile for Alex. She made sure he was fed, that he had what little toys they could afford, and that he knew he was loved. But then, slowly, things started to change. It started with his father's behavior. At first, Alex didn't understand it. His father, once warm and kind, had become distant. The fight started slowly, but they escalated quickly. Alex's father, a man who had once laughed with his family, now only yelled. He would come home late at night, smelling of alcohol, his face flushed with anger. The shouting would start immediately, like a storm that came out of nowhere. Alex could remember the way his mother would try to calm him down, her hands shaking as she spoke. But the anger in his father's eyes was unrelenting. "What do you think you're doing, huh?" Alex's father would yell. "Do you think we're just going to get by with nothing? You want us to be poor forever?" Alex had learned to shrink into the corner of his room, to keep his head down, to stay out of the way. His mother would try to shield him, but there was no stopping the anger that poured from his father. Every night felt like a battle, one that Alex didn't understand, one that never seemed to end. Then, one evening, Alex overheard his mother crying in the kitchen. It wasn't the soft, comforting kind of cry he was used to. This was different. This was desperation. Alex stood at the doorway, too afraid to step in, his heart pounding as he heard his mother's voice, broken and fragile. "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending it's okay. I'm so tired, Peter. I'm so tired." His father didn't respond. There was only silence after that, a silence that rang louder than any words could. The next morning, when Alex woke up, his father was gone. His mother hadn't told him where he had gone, or if he would come back. But from that moment on, everything changed. His mother tried to keep going to make sure Alex had what he needed, but the weight of it all was too much. The bills piled up. The rent couldn't be paid. Alex's mother became weaker and weaker, and though she tried to hide it, he could see it in her eyes. The same bright eyes that used to shine with hope were now dull, filled with exhaustion and sadness. One evening, as Alex sat at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal, his mother collapsed. The sound of her body hitting the floor sent a jolt of fear through Alex's small frame. He rushed to her side, calling her name over and over, but she didn't respond. Her breathing was shallow, weak. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know what was happening, only that it was something terrible. Alex tried to keep the panic from overwhelming him, but it was impossible. He remembered the way he ran to the neighbors, pounding on their door, shouting for help. But by the time they came, it was too late. His mother was gone. The world that had once been filled with love and laughter crumbled into silence. The apartment felt like an empty shell, no longer a home. Alex couldn't understand why his mother had to leave him. He couldn't understand why she hadn't been strong enough to fight whatever had taken her away. And most of all, he couldn't understand why no one had been there to help. After her death, Alex was left alone. No one came to check on him, no family appeared. The world simply moved on, leaving him behind. His father had never returned, and Alex was forced to fend for himself in a world that had no room for a lonely, scared child. That's when the streets called to him. The cold, indifferent streets became his refuge. He had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. The city that had once seemed so full of promise now seemed like a maze, a place full of danger and uncertainty. But he survived, just like his mother had taught him to. And through it all, there was Max, the dog who had come into his life like a silent guardian, watching over him as he navigated the harsh reality of the streets. But as Alex sat in the alley now, his hands resting on his knees, he couldn't help but wonder, was there more out there for him? A part of him still clung to the memory of his mother's voice, her words of hope, of adventure. Was there a way out of this life? Or was this all there would ever be for him? Max stirred beside him, as if sensing his thoughts. The dog raised his head, his amber eyes meeting Alex's gaze. In that moment, Alex knew he wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, there was hope for something more. The first few days after his mother's death had been a blur. Alex wandered through the streets, feeling as though he were moving through a fog, the world spinning around him while he remained frozen in place. He didn't know where to go or what to do. The apartment, once filled with his mother's laughter and warmth, now felt like a cold, empty tomb. The silence was suffocating. It was a silence that had followed him as he left the apartment, the weight of his mother's absence heavy on his heart. The streets, though crowded with people, were just as empty as the apartment had been. People rushed by without a second glance, too busy with their own lives to notice the lonely boy in tattered clothes. Alex had no one. He was just a child, abandoned by his family, left to fend for himself in a world that had no place for him. He hadn't known where to go at first, just wandered aimlessly, hoping for some kind of direction, some sign that things might get better. But all he found were cold, indifferent faces and streets that seemed to stretch on forever, leading nowhere. The hunger gnawed at him constantly, making his stomach ache in ways he had never known before. The nights were the hardest. The cold seeped through his clothes, chilling him to the bone, and the dark corners of the city became more terrifying with every passing hour. That was when Max appeared. Max wasn't the kind of dog Alex had expected to find. He was large, black, and rough-looking, his coat matted with dirt, and his eyes filled with a quiet intelligence that Alex hadn't seen in any other dog. He had appeared one evening while Alex was sitting on the curb, too exhausted to move, too lost to care. The dog had padded up slowly, his ears perked, and had stopped right in front of Alex. For a moment, Alex had stared at him, unsure of whether to be afraid or relieved. But the dog had simply sat down next to him, looking up at him with those deep, amber eyes, as if to say, "I'm here." That moment had changed everything. Max had been his silent companion ever since, never leaving his side. He had shared the scraps of food Alex managed to find, always watching over him as if he knew the world could be cruel. The bond between them was unspoken, but it was stronger than anything Alex had known. Max was his protector, his family, in a world that had taken everything else away. Together, they lived in the alley behind a rundown building. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. The alley was dark, the walls covered in grime, and the ground was littered with trash, but it was a shelter from the outside world. At night, Alex and Max would curl up together, trying to find warmth in each other's presence. Max's large body, though rough and worn, provided a sense of security that Alex desperately needed. The days were spent scavenging for food. Alex had learned to be resourceful, to find whatever scraps the city offered. Sometimes, he would stumble upon a half-eaten sandwich or a forgotten piece of bread. Other times, he would dig through trash cans, hoping to find something that could fill the hunger that gnawed at him. It was a life of survival, one where every day felt like a fight. But through it all, Max remained by his side. The dog never complained. He never asked for more. He was simply there, his presence steady and constant, a silent reminder that Alex was not truly alone. Despite the hardships, Alex found a strange sense of peace in those moments with Max. There were no harsh words, no cruel eyes judging him. It was just the two of them, making do with what little they had, relying on each other to survive. And in that quiet bond, Alex began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could make it. With Max by his side, the world didn't seem quite as dark, and the hunger didn't feel quite as painful. As night fell over the city, Alex curled up on the cold pavement, Max lying beside him, his body warm and comforting. The city, with all its noise and danger, faded into the background. For a moment, Alex allowed himself to sleep, knowing that no matter what tomorrow brought, he wouldn't face it alone. It was early afternoon, and Alex was crouched beside a garbage bin, sifting through scraps left by the nearby restaurants. The familiar pang of hunger gnawed at his stomach, making him search with a determination he had long grown used to. Max sat nearby, his watchful eyes scanning their surroundings, his body tense and ready, always alert. Just as Alex pulled a half-eaten sandwich from a discarded bag, he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up to see a group of boys, older and larger than him, striding toward him with sneers plastered across their faces. He knew their type. They were the kids who enjoyed taunting those weaker than them, who found amusement in the misfortune of others. One of the boys, the tallest of the group, smirked as he noticed the sandwich in Alex's hand. "Look at this little rat, digging through trash for food," he jeered, his voice dripping with contempt. The others laughed, emboldened by their leader's taunts. Alex felt his face flush with embarrassment, but he said nothing. He had learned that words only made things worse. He kept his gaze down, clutching the sandwich tightly, hoping they would lose interest and leave. But they didn't. Another boy reached out, shoving Alex backward, making him stumble. "Did you hear me, rat?" the boy sneered, his eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. Before Alex could react, a low, menacing growl filled the air. Max stepped forward, his body stiff, his gaze locked onto the group of bullies. His lips pulled back, revealing sharp teeth, and his growl grew louder, more threatening. The boys' laughter faltered, their expressions changing from amusement to fear. "Whoa, get that mud away from me," the leader shouted, taking a step back, his bravado quickly fading. Max held his ground, his protective gaze never leaving Alex. The boys hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. They hadn't expected this, a fierce dog, standing guard over the boy they thought was an easy target. With one final look of irritation and fear, the leader scowled and muttered, "Whatever, let's go." As the bullies retreated, Alex let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He knelt down beside Max, resting his hand on the dog's warm fur. "Thank you, Max," he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. Max's gaze softened, his tail giving a small wag as if to say, "I'll always be here to protect you." Days had passed since the encounter with the bullies, and Alex and Max had settled back into their quiet routine. Alex sat with his back against the cold brick wall, his gaze distant as he shared a piece of bread he'd managed to scavenge with Max. The city was alive around them, indifferent as ever, with people rushing by without a second glance. But today was different. A woman, her steps gentle and her expression soft, approached the alley. She was dressed in a warm coat, her eyes searching until they settled on Alex. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze filled with a kindness Alex hadn't seen in a long time. "Hello there," she said gently, her voice warm and sincere. "My name is Sarah. I work with children who need a little extra help." She smiled, kneeling down so she was at his eye level. Alex looked up, wary but curious. People rarely stopped to talk to him, let alone offer any kindness. "I've seen you around here a few times," Sarah continued, her eyes flicking to Max, who was watching her closely. "You and your dog look out for each other, don't you?" Alex nodded, glancing down at Max, whose protective stance softened just a little. He sensed something different about her, a sincerity he wasn't used to. Sarah reached out, her voice gentle. "There's a place where you can stay, where you'll be safe. Both of you." She looked at Max with a reassuring smile. "I promise." For the first time in a long time, Alex felt a glimmer of hope, a faint spark lighting up the darkness he had lived in for so long. That night, Alex lay curled up beside Max in their usual spot in the alley, his mind racing with thoughts of Sarah's offer. The idea of leaving the only life he'd known was both thrilling and terrifying. He stared up at the faint stars peeking through the narrow strip of sky between the buildings, his heart pounding with uncertainty. Max lay close, his body warm against Alex's side. The dog sensed his turmoil, lifting his head to look at him, his amber eyes calm and steady. Alex reached over, running his hand over Max's fur, finding comfort in the familiar feeling. "What do you think, Max?" he whispered. "Do you think we could really have a place of our own?" Max blinked, his tail giving a small, hopeful wag, as if he understood. In that quiet, shared moment, Alex felt a shift inside him, a small but growing resolve. He wasn't sure what the future held, but with Max by his side, maybe, just maybe, they could face it together. The next day, when Sarah returned, Alex was ready to give her an answer. The next morning, Alex took a deep breath, standing beside Max as Sarah led them away from the alley. Sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the city. For the first time, Alex didn't look back. Max walked proudly beside him, his tail wagging, as if sensing the promise of something better. As they crossed the threshold into their new life, Alex felt a weight lift from his heart. He didn't know what lay ahead, but with Max beside him, he finally believed in a future filled with hope.